Initially, everybody got a proper burial, but after a while, when there were so many dead bodies, they just used to dig a big pit and then they'd throw the bodies in and cover them with lime and chuck earth on top of that. It was actually a nightmare of a job being one of these buriers for two reasons. Firstly, because you were forced to live inside the cemetery, and secondly, you were only allowed to work when it was dark, so it must have been virtually impossible for them to see what they were doing. But I could probably just about handle being a plague burier, and a seeker of the dead I could possibly do. But there's one plague job I couldn't touch with a barge pole. Yes. Aren't they gorgeous? There's nothing like that little mewing noise and the warm, soft fur of the nation's favourite pets, is there? But during the plague, they were thought to carry disease, which brings us to our next worst job. The parishes of London hired dog and cat killers, and they had a cull. 40,000 dogs and 80,000 cats and kittens were put to their death. At rates of pay between 1 and 2 pence a carcass, the killers were well on their way to earning the national average wage of £1 a day. Mind you, they didn't use humane methods, they used anything they could get their hands on. Knives, logs of wood, clubs, mallets. But it was all a tragic waste, because we now know that these are exactly the kinds of animals that could have kept the rat population down, and plague is carried by the fleas on rats. So poor little Bobo and little Truffles lost their lives in vain. They say never work with animals, but it was a tip completely ignored by the people who did my next worst job. They were in the business of advertising quack medicines, and the gimmicks they used were as dodgy as the products. This is a toad. He's quite harmless unless you try to eat him, in which case he exudes this foul-tasting liquid which makes you feel pretty ill. And yet in Stuart times there was actually a job which involved putting one of these little things into your mouth. Welcome to the weird world of the toad eater. Popping down the market was the nearest thing ordinary folk had to nipping down the doctors for a course of antibiotics. For the stallholders in search of a quick sale, it was a matter of putting your money where your mouth is. Why on earth did people eat toads?
Well, I think it's money. I think it comes down to money in the first place. These are people who are essentially the sidekicks of a quack doctor, someone who's trying to sell their medicines. And he's employing someone to either swallow a toad or pretend to swallow a toad as a means of demonstrating the powers of the medicine that the quack doctor wants to sell to his public. If you see someone actually swallowing a toad, which is meant to be poisonous, and seems to be recovering, then, wow, that's quite sensational.
Toad eater or toady became the nickname for any kind of servile creep or crawler. In return for a few pennies, people were even prepared to eat tapeworms or dangle snakes round their necks. What kind of lives do you think these toadies would have lived?
Well, along with the quack doctor who employed them, I would have thought they were probably itinerant. A lot of quack doctors this period moved around. One, because you want to get away from the scene of the crime, so to speak, to satisfy clients. And the other thing is you moved around from fair to market around the region, because that's where all the custom is.
It's starting to get a bit frisky. Do you think they really did swallow them?
And this is the question. I mean, in all the information we have, it's very unclear. You get sort of doubting comments in diaries in the 17th century saying, do you know someone who's actually sort of eaten one of these toads? And say, well, so-and-so told me they've eaten the toad. So, I mean, there's various options. One is they ate the toad and had suffered an upset stomach afterwards, which you would. I mean, you're not going to die from eating a toad. But certainly the sort of toxins in the skin there would make you upset. Perhaps they regurgitate it, and that's another option. My own feeling is that it's a con trick, you know, it's a bit of sleight of hand.
It's got to be.
Yes, I think so. I mean, it's just not worth the pain for the toad eater of indulging in this, when perhaps, you know, he could practice and be a skilled bit of sleight of hand will do the trick just as well.
But modern science knows what the Stuarts didn't, that maybe a toad slipping down your throat wasn't as dangerous as the toad eaters made out. It wouldn't kill you, so the trick was safer than you might think. Right, I'm surrounded by curious onlookers. They all want this little thing to disappear inside me. Do I swallow it and throw it up afterwards? Or do I just palm it? This is not a very nice idea, but... In 1666, following the Great Plague, London was wiped out by another natural disaster. The Great Fire swept away huge swathes of the city and left the old St Paul's Cathedral in ruins. In its place, they commissioned Sir Christopher Wren to design a magnificent new cathedral. It was to be his masterpiece and a bold new statement to hail in a new London and a new century. It's impossible to imagine London without St Paul's Cathedral, isn't it? It's a defining landmark and the climax of the career of Sir Christopher Wren. In fact, on his tombstone it says, "If you want to see my monument, look around you." Although, of course, it wasn't just Wren who built this place. It was built by thousands of people whose names we don't know. For instance, have you ever heard of James Thornhill? Probably not, although he was one of the most famous artists of his day. Famous and yet unfortunate, because his worst job was to paint the inside of that entire dome. But this worst job is a complete one-off, and Thornhill's tragic story shows that you don't have to be knee-deep in muck to have a terrible time. The cathedral took 35 years to build, and originally a French artist was commissioned to paint the murals inside the dome. But the colourful designs were too flamboyant and Roman Catholic for the new Church of England cathedral, so the commissioners appointed James Thornhill instead. He painted in a style called grisaille, which used muted greys and browns to depict a much more restrained Protestant series of scenes from St Paul's life. There's loads of reasons why this is a worse job, but one of the most obvious is the walk to work. If you work in one of those office blocks, even at the very top, then you have the luxury of a lift. But for Thornhill, there would have been a 3/4 of an hour trudge before he even got to here. Now, normally, if I went through this window, I'd end up as a rather nasty splodge on the floor below. But not today, because St Paul's is undergoing a unique restoration project, so we've got a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to see the inside, just as Thornhill would have seen it. The restoration team have suspended a huge scaffold from the lantern at the top of the dome, which virtually fills a quarter of the space. Thornhill wouldn't have had the benefit of such a stable structure, which is mind-blowing when you think of the scale of the building. We're really starting to get a sense of height now, aren't we?
We certainly are. We're starting to see the first of the Thornhill scheme starting here.
This is Thornhill over here?
It's all original Thornhill, yeah.
So what are these rings?
Well, we think those rings actually relate to a mid-19th century restoration that occurred here, but it reflects very much what we think may have been the means of access for Thornhill.
These were for the scaff?
Exactly. So we think wooden poles would have butted to the wall and be located to these rings with a 10 or 20 foot extension. The end of the